Great to be here. So we've talked a little bit already today about the idea of genetics and a future that some see has incredible possibilities, transhumanism, the idea of man living forever, the man being made into more machine, but for a good cause, for technology to help our lives be better. Neuralink by Elon Musk that we can implant in our head. I mean, these are the future conversations that are happening. So I wonder, just from your seat, I mean, are these things that we should be alarmed by? Should we be celebrating? This is human innovation. This is God's creative design playing out in human beings, and so we'd be crazy to decry it? What are your thoughts on that?
So we should certainly celebrate innovation in science and technology, and our increased discoveries of the natural world, the created order and how it works. But the uses of science and technology can, in certain circumstances, be dehumanizing. And if you drill down deeply into the ideology of transhumanism, for example, you see a couple of problems with it. One is that it rehashes and kind of recapitulates in new forms old ideas that have been proven dehumanizing and destructive, especially ideas from the eugenics movement that was so influential in the late 19th century and really through the entire 20th century, not just in Germany, but also in the United States and Great Britain.
So many people, talk about that for a minute, because many people do assume eugenics is just a word that sits with Hitler in Germany, but I know in your work you've talked about how, no, this was an American idea.
That's right. So a majority of states in the US had eugenic sterilization laws where people would be involuntarily sterilized by the state if they were deemed to be defective in some way, usually cognitively or mentally, or because they had a mental illness, but sometimes people with physical disabilities as well. Infamous Supreme Court case upholding Virginia's sterilization law in 1927, where the Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., writing for the majority, upheld the state of Virginia in sterilizing Carrie Buck. And the famous line there was that the principle that allows for forced vaccination is, quote, wide enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes. And then in a Supreme Court majority decision, the infamous line, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So this dehumanizing language of certain people being defective by virtue of having some disability or impairment. So certainly science and medicine needs to do what we can to heal and to help people overcome and live with and deal with disabilities. But the idea of eliminating people, the idea of eliminating someone's opportunity to procreate obviously takes things too far.
So let's talk about bioethics and gene therapy. That's a new term. People are just getting familiar with gene therapy and what that means. But as you educate so many others, will you do that for us now? Sure. Will you just define for us a few of the terms so that people can start to understand what we're even talking about?
Sure. So when we talk about gene editing or using technologies to change our genetic structure, there's 2 basic distinctions that I think are helpful. The first is we can use this to alter the genes of one person, right? I can take out your bone marrow and tinker with the genes in some of your white blood cells and transplant your own bone marrow back into you. And there are therapies, for example, that try to program some of your white blood cells to attack a cancer that's in your body selectively. So that could be a cancer treatment, right? When I do that, that's only going to impact you. You can give informed consent for that intervention. You can take on the risks if that doesn't go well, if that ends up harming you. At least you've been informed of those risks. And as with any other medical intervention, you can make that choice. There's another form of gene therapy, and usually this is done at the embryonic stage of development. So we take an embryo in a lab, we alter the embryo's genes, or we take sperm and egg, the gametes, and alter the genes in the gametes, and then create a new human life in the lab. What happens when you do that is that you alter genes that will be passed on through the next generations, basically indefinitely, right? So if I alter the genes of an embryo, those alterations are going to affect that embryo's sperm and egg if that child is brought to birth and has children, and they will be passed on through the generations. So that gets into very dangerous territory, right? Because if something goes wrong with that, it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle. And it's impacting people who cannot give consent, people who are not even born yet. So that basic distinction between what we call somatic gene editing and germline gene editing. Somatic gene editing just affecting the person who consents to it. Germline gene editing affecting future generations is important, I think, for bioethics. And the other distinction, which you sort of alluded to this morning, is the idea of using gene editing to treat a disease, altering the gene that causes sickle cell anemia so that someone no longer has that disorder, versus using gene editing for purposes of quote unquote human enhancement, taking someone who's healthy and trying to make them, as some people have said, better than well, bigger, faster, stronger, smarter. Again, that latter category, I think, is much more ethically and morally complicated, problematic for Christians who have to have some basic regard for the given, for the natural order that God has created. There's certainly a risk there of overweening pride or hubris, saying that I'm not good enough as I am, I'm not good enough as God has created me, even though my body is functioning and flourishing as it was designed to do. Yeah. I need to implant a chip in my brain and link up to the cloud and become part of the internet of bodies in order to achieve my destiny or my purpose. And I think Christians should be very wary of that. That can easily slide into the space of an alternative religion, of a kind of idol.
And it seems C.S. Lewis, Abolition of Man, he's thinking about these things. He's writing about them. He's predicting it. Could you imagine him now, like seeing some of the conversations we're entering? I want to go back to something you said. You mentioned informed consent. Now, this is an idea, I would say, over the last 2 years that felt it was disregarded in a lot of ways, although it has great history that this is part of being a doctor. This is part of how public health goes forward, how a doctor-patient relationship should work. What is your feelings about where informed consent, what happened to it?
Well, I'm very concerned about the fact that over the last 2 years in many of our public health policies, informed consent, which is a core principle of medical ethics, of research ethics, was basically thrown overboard while we were in this sort of crisis phase, and this idea of forced vaccination, vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, excluding people from the ability to work, to make a living, to travel, to go to a restaurant, if they didn't accept this public health intervention, clearly and obviously violates the principle of informed consent, which goes back to our response to eugenics, actually. After the horrors of Nazi medicine during the Second World War and the violation of the patients who were in concentration camps, who were experimented upon without their consent, we had the Nuremberg trials, in which a dozen doctors were tried for crimes against humanity. About 8 of them received actually the death sentence, and a few of them ended up hanging for those horrific crimes. The Nuremberg trials led to the creation of the Nuremberg Code. And I actually recommend that folks in the audience look up the Nuremberg Code online and read it. It's not a complicated legal document. It's like 1 page. There's 10 provisions in it. But the first and core doctrine articulated in the Nuremberg Code is this idea of informed consent. That before I accept a medical intervention or before I enroll in a research study, I need to be told the risks, benefits, and alternatives to that treatment. And I need to be given the ability freely, without external coercion or constraint, to accept or refuse that proposed intervention. And when you don't allow people to do that, even if your motives are good, even if you're doing it supposedly for the greater good, you end up violating human dignity in very profound ways. So that's a real concern of mine.
Well, and it gets into the freedom of conscience idea. So somebody by their conscience goes, I actually am not comfortable, or I don't have enough information to make a good decision, or this isn't right for me. The coercion really can kick in. And I want to talk about that for a minute, because last year we had Dr. Francis Collins with us, who's head of NIH, and he was talking a lot about the new vaccine that they had developed, and specifically he was talking about mRNA, which essentially is like a gene therapy type tool, right, that delivers its dose through that. And he was talking about it as a miracle. Like this really would change the game. It was going to change everything. There were high expectations. I want to get your comments on it, but first I want to watch Elon Musk as he riffs about mRNA. I think it'll be kind of funny.
I think there's going to be a lot of breakthroughs on the medical front, particularly around synthetic mRNA. You can basically do anything with synthetic RNA, DNA. It's like a computer program. So, I think with effort that's not too crazy, you could probably stop aging, reverse it if you want. You can basically do it. You can turn someone into a freaking butterfly if you want with the right DNA sequence.
Raise your hand if you want to be turned into a butterfly.
Should Elon just stick to like space and Twitter?
Well,
what?
Yeah.
As somebody who understands gene therapy,
Twitter
18. Yeah.
Space, if he can make it there.
18 months ago, it was this miracle thing, and I'm wondering from your perspective, how do you evaluate how mRNA held up? What have we learned about it?
Modern science for the last 500, and by modern I mean the last 500 years, has always been tempted by these utopian dreams, right? So we should be cautious about utopianism in science. When we're listening to something like that, we're probably slipping away from good empirical science and embracing a kind of Gnostic religion, actually. So that's my little sidebar on that. mRNA technology is powerful, and we should be paying close attention to it. Our mass vaccination campaign with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines was our first effort at bringing mRNA technology to some sort of human therapy. And we're going to learn a lot about what happened over the next year or two. A lot of things that happened are things that I think we should be very concerned about. To make a long story short, we are tinkering with an enormously complex system, an enormously delicate system that we barely understand, right? So the idea that by sort of reprogramming human software using gene technology, we can recreate human beings in whatever image and likeness we want is a utopian dream that I think is going to backfire, even on scientific grounds, because the system that we're tinkering with is so delicately tuned and immensely complex. Human beings are not hardware that require twice-a-year software updates, which is what the mRNA vaccine sort of became after we realized that whatever effects that we got from them were very short-term. Efficacy declined at about 4 to 6 months, and by 6 months was well below the threshold set for FDA approval of a vaccine. So then we had the idea of a booster, but what we're seeing with the boosters is that the efficacy window with each subsequent booster is even shorter than the last, to the point now where the fourth shot looks like it might offer some efficacy for only about 6 or 8 weeks. So we're getting diminishing returns as we're doubling down, tripling down, quadrupling down on this technology as a way out of the pandemic.
And just to be clear, we're not giving medical advice here. We're just talking
Correct.
about, we're kind of reflecting on the last year and what you're seeing.
This is well-known science on efficacy of vaccines. I mean, the other thing that has popped up in the last month is that there was one study looking at liver cells in a laboratory. And the caveat, this has not been replicated yet in humans, in vivo. It's been done in vitro in the laboratory, that the mRNA has been reverse transcribed and inserted into the DNA of these human liver cell lines. So we were promised that this would not alter our DNA in any way. And typically, genetics goes from DNA to RNA to protein. So it's usually a one-way street. But we know from HIV and other retroviruses and other things that RNA can sometimes go in reverse.
Is that called original antigenic sin?
No, that's a different issue. I think that would take us down a rabbit hole.
Well, that's a whole interesting subject in gene therapy.
But there are a dozen of these pending questions that this technology and the results that we're seeing have raised. And we now have more questions than we have answers.
So one of my challenges back 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, when this conversation was coming up, was all the Christian leaders in the room seemed to not want to ask these deeper ethical questions. The only ethical question around this vaccine was, is it coming from an aborted fetus? Right. Not, what is the technology that's being used? Why do you think that was? Why do you think there wasn't more questions?
So I think there was a social climate in which there was a lot of fear. So the lockdowns created social isolation. We were interacting with one another behind screens. We were cut off from our usual sources of support, including perhaps our places of worship. So we also had an invisible pathogen that people were afraid of. And the specter of asymptomatic spread, which never actually had any scientific basis but was taken up in the media, basically turned every other person into a potential threat to my existence. So this was an intolerable state for people to be in. We were subjected to a combination of social isolation and fear of something that seemed utterly outside of our control. Human beings cannot exist for very long in that state. We need to find a way out of that. And when certain elements in the public health establishment were proposing that we're going to have a way out, or we're very close to having a way out, or we now have a way out, and it's going to be the solution to this, people were so hungry for that they embraced it. So I think that was one of the factors. People were also worried that if I raise any questions or ask any inconvenient probing questions or point to anything that might undermine people's confidence in this therapeutic, it might end up harming people, right? So if I increase someone's vaccine hesitancy and they don't take the vaccine and then they die of COVID, is that going to be on my conscience? I think that was a worry for a lot of people of goodwill. But science cannot function in a climate that includes censorship, that stops and prevents people from asking questions. Yeah. And I think there was a social setting in which people felt they needed to do that, but I think now we can see in retrospect that was a mistake.
So one of the topics we're talking about today is the biodigital kind of merging, the technology with the body and this future. And you've written some about this future. Paint a picture for us of where you see some of this going and how we as Christians and as an ethicist, what are some of the questions we need to be asking as we consider the future that may be presented to us?
So what we've seen in the last 20 years, what's accelerated during the pandemic, is the rise of what some people have called the biomedical security state, which sounds like a sort of scary thing coming down the pike, a totalitarian type regime that we may be living under in the future. But the basic idea is that we've seen a merging of three things: public health, digital technologies of surveillance and control, facilitated by smartphones and other novel technologies, and the police powers of the state to coerce certain things that people may or may not want to accept. And with this confluence of these three things, I think we're entering a period of time in which we need to think very, very carefully about issues related to privacy, about issues related to personal autonomy, about issues related to our embodied existence. So I mentioned this term Gnosticism earlier. In the early days of Christianity, Gnostic religions were sort of the main competitor to Christianity, and sometimes passed themselves off as sort of quasi-Christian. But the basic idea behind Gnosticism was that the material world is something that we need to overcome. And the ancient Gnostics tried to overcome it by escaping from the world into a kind of higher realm. I think the neo-Gnostics, today's transhumanists, try to escape the material realm by this sort of utopian future. It's a sort of horizontal version of the same mistake. But our physical embodiment is not something that we as Christians can reject. The doctrine of creation, the doctrine of the incarnation, that God became man and took on human flesh, does not allow us to reject the flesh because it was created by God and redeemed by Christ. So it's broken, it's wounded by original sin, we're subject to illness, disease, and disability, and we have to contend with that. But we also have to have a basic regard for nature and for human nature and for what is given in creation. This idea that my body is just pure raw material that can be manipulated any which way I want is bound to backfire. In the interest of making us more than human, which is the transhumanist dream, we're going to end up dehumanizing ourselves and enslaving ourselves to whether it's technologies or whether it's the control and surveillance of other people that have particular financial interests or political motivations or whatever. I think these trends that we're seeing in this direction that we're moving in is something that all of us as Christians need to be paying close attention to.
Well, thank you for your faithful work to help us pay attention, to try to help us think better about some of these new ideas we've not really heard about. And Dr. Aaron Kheriaty has a Substack I would say is worth subscribing to and following, where you can read more about some of the ways in which he's seeing these things come together and will provoke great thinking and thought. So Dr. Kheriaty, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.